cybersecurity in the microgrid. My name is Dylan Lockwood. I am the online content editor for Zpryme. If you've ever listened to our podcast, I do that. If you were at one of the things this morning, one of the talks this morning where I read off some questions and went on too long, that was also me. But we're here to talk today. We're here today to talk about cybersecurity in the microgrid. We've got a great panel lined up for that. Erik, we'll start with you. Just go down the line. Why don't you just say who you are, who you work for, and what you do in this space, cybersecurity space.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. We've got a smallish room here with an intermittent setting, so I'm hoping we have a good discussion. My name is Erik Svanholm, and I'm the CEO of IPERC, and we provide secure, intelligent control systems for microgrids for a variety of applications, from C&I to utility to defense, and I oversee that operation. We're a wholly owned, independently operated subsidiary of S&C Electric Company. And among our claims to fame in the controls space for microgrids is that 2 of our DoD facilities have achieved what's known as a authority to operate, or ATO, which means that the microgrid controller is deemed secure enough to connect to military networks, which is a high bar to clear. So that's our background and our placement in the microgrid industry.
Erfan, Ibrahim, and I am the CEO and founder of the BitBazaar Consulting Group. I've had this for about 16 years. While I have had stints at Zpryme and NREL, where I ran their cybersecurity programs. And what I'm doing now is with a team of people from defense and intelligence who have worked offensively for our country. They are taking the architecture that I have developed for power systems and are now ready to apply it at utilities, so you don't need to do forklift upgrades of power systems. It's a very unique approach that doesn't depend on standards and doesn't depend on a bunch of what I call edge security. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we speak about the subject of microgrids, because it applies as much in generation as it does in transmission, distribution, and end use.
Good afternoon. I'm Fred Bonewell, Chief Security and Safety Officer for CPS Energy in San Antonio. We provide electric and gas service to over 1.3 million customers in the city of San Antonio and the surrounding Bexar County. We are the largest public power municipally owned utility in the United States. My responsibilities include both cyber and physical security and what we call integrated security. Labor relations, our safety, both employee and public, as well as business continuity and fleet operations. I'm pleased to be here.
Right. I'm glad to have you all here. So, Erik, why are we talking about microgrids when it comes to cybersecurity?
Lots of reasons. Microgrids really represent kind of both sides of the coin of cybersecurity in the energy world. On one hand, microgrids can provide a hedge against disruptions to the utility grid from cyber attacks by being able to operate autonomously and independently from the utility grid. But conversely, connecting microgrids to the utility grid necessarily means you're connecting at the periphery a whole bunch of new equipment that wasn't there before and that isn't necessarily owned or operated or managed by the utility itself. In addition, microgrids often have third-party financiers, owners, operators that want to stay connected with what's happening with the microgrid itself. And so often you have connections to remote sites from microgrid locations that provide additional potential attack vectors for cybersecurity. So on one hand, you open the door to potentially new attack vectors. On the other hand, a secure, independently operating microgrid can be a protection against attacks against the bigger grid.
Fred, from the utility perspective, how do you see cybersecurity in the microgrid shaping up?
Really nothing different than the regular system. We have to have a zero tolerance for threats, both from any direction, whether it's from the microgrid perspective or from our internal infrastructure and our SCADA. So it's all inclusive in our environment. And we, like you mentioned, contractors and vendors working through a third party. We have a very sophisticated passport control system for how we vet contractors. So it's not just about how we vet them for safety, but it's about how we might even include for microgrid security reviewing their backgrounds, looking at the systems they use or bring onto our property to make sure that they're the right systems and the right people are operating them with the right authentication.
So Erfan, how are cybersecurity problems kind of unique in this space, and how does that affect the development of solutions? Because it's not a one size fits all approach when it comes to solutions, I think.
Right. So first, let's try to understand why we need microgrids. It's not just because hospitals and the military and schools want to have their own destiny when it comes to energy. That's just part of the story. If you want high penetration of variable, intermittent, renewable energy, and you want to have a grid that is as reliable as the one that we have today with coal and nuclear and hydro, you have to have microgrids. And I'll explain why. Microgrids act as shock absorbers for variable, intermittent, renewable energy. I believe there was a talk from the SNC CEO. I think, is he in the room? I think he's there. He brought up a very good technical point in his plenary session when he spoke about the variability and the need to create the proper power system design to absorb that. Now, I don't want to get too nerdy and geeky on you, but the voltage ampere reactance, which is part of AC systems, and that when you hear about ancillary services, it's big, to provide the appropriate VAR support. That VAR support doesn't travel very well on wires over long distances. So that's why you need microgrids, so that if there's highly variable renewable energy, what you do is two things. You balance it locally in the microgrid, and then you supply steady power back to the grid. Not only is this good from reliability perspective, but from a cyber perspective, now you've created a barrier between all the renewable energy assets in the microgrid and the utility. So if you put the appropriate safeguards at the microgrid and say, I'm only going to move data, whether it's control data or telemetry data, on a need basis, now you've created that firewall. I'm not talking about an actual appliance. I'm talking about a business model. And this is why it's critical for cybersecurity with renewable energy to do it in the form of microgrids.
So yeah, as Erik said, because there are so many different hands involved in a microgrid, it makes it a sort of unique vector of attack. But it sounds like what you're saying is that it's not just a programming solution. It's there's a lot that has to do with people that you put in these systems as well.
Yes. So let's talk shop. Okay, you don't get cybersecurity just like you don't get Zen from eating tofu. Okay, you're not going to get cybersecurity from power systems just by doing one thing, or like using encryption or using a firewall. No. First and foremost, in power systems, you got to understand the domain. The domain means what use cases, business use cases, you're going to run. And then based on that, you figure out who are the actors that are going to participate. And then you develop a cybersecurity architecture that opens the doors for those use cases to run while not opening additional doors for attacks. Now, many people in the power industry don't do that. What they do is they rely on a cyber group that's very good with firewalls and antivirus, and they come up with a technical solution before they've solved the business problem. And I think that's a fundamental mistake. Architecture is number one, before even compliance. You can map architecture to compliance, whether it's NERC CIP or NIST 800-53 or whatever. But if you don't have an architecture that supports your business use cases and power systems, you're asking for trouble. Because you know what a hacker is? They're just creators of new use cases. That's all they are. They're very innovative. So technology can only help you so much. It's really understanding your business, establishing a robust architecture that supports that business, minimizing the exposure to hackers. How do you do that? Move data on a need basis. Quiet down your network. Then you have a prayer with intrusion detection and firewalls and network segmentation. If you don't quiet down your network, there'll be so many false positives coming from your cyber products, you're going to be overwhelmed. So there's an easy way to solve this problem and a very difficult way. Unfortunately, as I see across the industry, we're using the more difficult way, trying to incorporate security controls into power system protocols. I mean, come on. The insider threat and the advanced persistent threat laughs at those controls that are coming out of IEC and IEEE and from NIST. They are just meant for amateur high school type hackers. Today's advanced persistent, you'll tell from the people that he deals with in the military. We've gone way beyond that. So let's get out of high school and get into college when it comes to cyber. We really, really need to have a good understanding of our infrastructure before we start protecting it.
So Erik, when we were talking a little bit earlier about all this stuff, and you used a phrase that I thought was really interesting. You said that when dealing with this sort of thing, you look at cybersecurity from the bottom up instead of from the top down. What does that kind of mean? Can you explain to everyone what that kind of means and how that strategy is applied?
Yeah, so it's, again, back to this idea that a microgrid really wants to be able to operate autonomously and independently from the grid when that's appropriate and useful, but also be a valuable member of the grid community when that's the optimal way to work. And so from our perspective, being microgrid controls providers, we're out there in the yard, in the dirt and the dust, connecting to generators and inverters and equipment and making sure all those devices work in concert while we monitor and manage loads at the microgrid level. So that's the bottom-up approach, and that's where our control world lives. Now, up at the top, in Fred's world, he's got a whole grid that's got to balance and be managed. And he's got to make sure that the controls and the cybersecurity and the operational protocols work across the entire grid, including the various microgrids that might be within its domain. And so there are security aspects to the microgrid controller itself, when it's operating by itself, that need to tie into the larger security considerations at the higher level. And so whether you approach it from the equipment level on up, which is kind of our perspective, or from a grid-wide perspective, making sure that systems permeate all the way down to our level, it's just a different approach to the same problem.
So in that,
Fred may have a different perspective.
Yeah, exactly. So in that sort of having the systems permeating down to the microgrid level, what would you say are systems that need to be updated or addressed to from the top down to deal with cybersecurity?
I think the thinking has to be changed. So I think it's a mindset change. It's a behavioral change. We have to look at with the end in mind and then build backwards. So our country was built with a grid that was not built to defend against hackers. It wasn't. So now we are faced with this threat that we can't see, but we know it's there. It's causing extreme damage. So we have to figure out how to build our defense systems to be as defensive as the ultimate offensive systems that are out there with the hackers. And some of that includes dealing with the FBI and our constituency in such a way that's creative. So our vision is to create an alliance where, with all of our partners, including our city owner, where we're working together, putting cyber experts together under one roof, in one area, with the FBI and with the DoD, so that we can force multiply the attention given to cyber. Because when we're independent, we're independent, and there's only a few of us in our companies supporting cyber. But when we're together and we're force multiplying the effort with the right focus in mind, then we can raise up our defense strategy to the level that is being able to defend against the ultimate offensive weapons that are out there, 24/7, 365. So I agree with my colleague that our industry has been totally reactive up to this point. We are waiting for these things to occur. It used to be our security systems were built around cameras and guards. Now the whole landscape has changed. And we're being faced with constant asks by our community and our customers to extend our systems further out to the customer. And that's where we have to be helpful, but also guarded at the same time. So it presents a whole host of challenges.
So I want to follow up on that. In that proactive strategy, because as Erfan said, it's not just a matter of buying a piece of software and boom, you're protected. So what is the proactive strategy? Who do we need to be hiring? What do we need to be developing?
Well, we already have folks inside, so we can't just change out personnel. It's a matter of engagement with the right folks who have the right level of training, that we can help infuse this skill and this knowledge to upgrade our people skills to the level that it needs to be as we're working with the FBI or the DOD or other corporate constituencies around our city, the city of San Antonio.
Yeah. So there is a systems engineering approach to solving the cybersecurity problem. When I say solving, I mean having a program that continually can look at the emerging threat. It starts with a cyber governance assessment of your organization, whether you're a microgrid owner or whether you're a utility. If you were a utility, I would expect 4 assessments to occur. The broadband group should have an assessment done. The telecom group should have an assessment done. The IT and the control. 4 groups should have their assessments done. What are these assessments? Look at those 386 controls from DOE C2M2 and the NIST cybersecurity framework. I have access to a software that I can do that in 5 to 6 hours now. It takes 6 figures normally for a consulting company to come and do an assessment. But we have streamlined it. It's very simple. Why do you need that? Because that creates a list of prioritized action items that these are the controls that you need to meet. Some could be as trivial as having a logging scheme for IT assets or hardware assets and so on. Some things could be more complicated. So then you figure out a shopping list of technologies that you need to buy and projects you need to establish to address those gaps. When you do that, there's a due diligence process for the technologies you need to bring in. That due diligence creates the language for the RFPs. Now the vendors come in, you are already informed on what's in the market to address those needs. The next thing you do is you do an architecture review of those technologies to see, do they fit into your cybersecurity architecture that you created before you did any procurement? And then if they fit, then you do the cyber pen testing, the red teaming, you do the scanning of their executables, you do the scanning of their binaries, and then you do data fuzz testing. You throw bogus values. Like for microgrids, this is really important, especially for mission critical functions. And you see, do you have the appropriate resilience in your applications to data fuzzing? And if not, then put the appropriate mitigations. And finally, you do the failure scenarios. Come up with ways in which the system can deteriorate and come up with mitigations for that. That's a decision tree model. And you do that in the good times. You don't do this when there's a cyber attack. And then finally, you train people, your IT, your OT, and your corporate staff. I've come up with this method as a way for all enterprises, whether they're utilities, healthcare, doesn't matter. Any digitally empowered enterprise can go through this systems engineering approach. Now, when you have new use cases, you develop this theme again to do that for the deltas. And you've got a nice program.
So that's a pretty solid strategy for utilities. But Erik, if I'm I'm say a technology provider, how can I distribute and install my technology and work through these partnerships while minimizing my liability?
Liability is a thorny question, and we should have our general counsel sitting here probably answering those kinds of questions. Generally speaking, we can say a few things. Certainly partner with reputable firms, assuming that your component goes into a larger scheme, whether it's within a microgrid or otherwise, as Erfan and Fred touched on, that you need to have a solid vetting of all the components that go into these systems. And so if you're a component provider, making sure that you're partnering with the right other organizations is pretty important. The other element is focusing on preventing harm to the system. If you have a microgrid or other utility system or energy system where there is a penetration by an outside party, but they don't actually do any harm, they don't extract any information or wreck any equipment, well, that's really where liability comes in. Right? If somebody gets in, you prevent them from doing anything bad, then you're probably in pretty good shape. You want to prevent them from getting in the first place, but if you can certainly prevent them from harming your system, then you're in good shape. So those are two of the top things I'd say on preventing liability if you're a component provider.
Maybe liability wasn't the best word. I guess what I'm trying to get at is how do we promote growth and innovation without taking on too much undue risk as an industry?
And I think Erfan touched on it, Fred as well, that really we have to think in terms of systems and we have to think in terms of frameworks. You can't really take building blocks off the shelf and assemble them willy-nilly. You need to understand where are the periphery components of your system that are exposed to the outside world. You've got to protect those. You've got to protect the perimeter. But that's only step one. You have to have a layered defensive approach that assumes that an attacker will get through the outer layer. And then you've got to build an architecture, as we've talked about, that accounts for these stops and preventions from attackers moving laterally inside your system and getting from system A to system B. And only by thinking strategically and in a framework model can you assemble a system of various components from various vendors that has a solid chance of standing up to attacks.
Erfan, I had a clarifying question because I'm not as familiar with this topic. So you were talking earlier about the insider attack, that problem. I'm not certain what sort of separate risk that carries and what sort of separate solution that entails. So can you explain that for me, please?
So let's distinguish between the amateur hacker or casual hacker and the insider threat or the advanced persistent threat, which actually is an insider threat. They use social engineering and phishing schemes to get a pivot, and then they become an insider. So they're really in one category. All the security controls that you're hearing coming out of IEC 62351 standard, or the IEEE P2030 group, or the NIST 800-53 standard, which enterprises are taking lock, stock, and barrel. Many public utility commissions are just taking the NIST document and saying, this is your cybersecurity requirements document. And you're like, that's like giving someone the Bible and saying, go be a good person. I mean, like, okay, there's Leviticus and there's people being smited, and I mean, like...
And this is Holy Week.
Yeah, exactly. This is Holy Week, exactly. So you know what I'm talking about. So, but this happens when people who are not domain experts, probably studied political science or some other very noble subject, were tasked now to be in charge of cybersecurity for a PUC. And this is what happens. So asset owners get indigestion when they get these kinds of requirements, or whether it's a city government in the case of Immuni, or a co-op board, doesn't matter. A lot of non-domain experts are postulating like armchair anthropologists on cybersecurity who have never been to a substation, ever.
have never really gone in a truck with an electrical worker to understand what happens in a utility. So let's bring some sanity to this drunken state. Okay? First and foremost, the insider threat is the one that has access to all the credentials of security that you put in a power system. Why? Because they're pivoting off a trusted node. I can take a keylogger and put it in any of your keyboards, in your office, and I'll have your username and password. And we did this when I was at NREL, just to try it out. I can get anyone's username. What's the big deal? How complicated, how many characters you have, doesn't matter. I'm an insider threat. Next, certificate authorities, you're sitting on the trusted system. How does the CA know that you're somebody else? They don't. The only prayer that you have with the insider threat is situational awareness. And situational awareness comes in two categories. One is intrusion detection with signatures from malware. That's the kind of things that a FireEye or a Palo Alto Networks or a Cisco IPS system can pick up. The other one is context-based intrusion detection. Context-based intrusion detection means that you understand the power system use case, you understand what are legitimate commands in Goose or MMS or whatever messaging protocol you're using for the SCADA function, and in the microgrid case, a lot of proprietary protocols are at work to manage those assets. And then understanding what is an acceptable range of values for that message that go with it. So it's a pair. It's a message, like a verb, and then it tells you how much you should go up and down on voltage and current and things like that. There are now intrusion detection systems and hardware layer filters available off the shelf in the market today that can do that. When you do that, then you can start watching the insider threat. Remember, these insider threats, whether it's a disgruntled employee who didn't get their Christmas bonus, but went for Python training and knows how to write little scripts, there's no malware, there's no signature. Palo Alto and FireEye and all these products are going to be blind as a bat in that environment. You can spend millions of dollars and not get anything on the OT side until you learn how to find out transactions that are not legitimate. Now, there's a fourth level of security. So the first level is access. Firewalls, role-based access control, antivirus, that kind of hygiene stuff. The second level is signature-based malware tools. The third is context-based, which I just described. There's a fourth level, which is now happening in research with ARPA-E, DOE, OE, SEDS is funding some. One of them is called the CODEF project. What they're doing is, at the microprocessor level, there are do's and don'ts. This is what we call non-network security, and it is a hacker's worst nightmare because they always like to pivot. They're not on the actual device everywhere. But if the security is not networked, there's no way to get to that thing to change it. And instead of having firmware, they burn it on the chip. So the transistors don't allow for any other function except that. So for some very high value assets, you'd want to put a filter like that. Then you can start addressing this insider or APT threat.
So I've got one more question before we move on to a couple audience questions. So we always tend to hear about cybersecurity in terms of getting us to appreciate the levels of threats that we're dealing with, as you just helpfully explained to us. But while I think a certain level of fear is definitely necessary with the gravity of the threats, I've got a question for all of you. Fred, we'll start with you. What's something encouraging to you about how far we've come through cybersecurity so far, and where we still have to go?
We're not there yet, by any means. I mean, yeah, we've made steps, but I think it's already been mentioned. This is a really high-risk environment where we can't take our eye off the ball at any time. We work in a 24/7, 365 environment. We have the duty and the obligation to our customers to make sure that we don't lose power as a result of a hack. That's totally unacceptable. It only gives me pause on Sunday night at about 10 o'clock when I'm ready for bed, where that day's gone well. But until I wake up the next morning, the whole landscape may have changed again. So we made huge progress. When I look back in my career in the power industry, which started in 1982, when it was only guards and cameras, literally, to where we are now, it's light years where we've been. But we've inherited a system that was not built preventing against hacks. So we're trying to kind of rethread everything and rebuild it as we go, or rebuild the plane as we fly it, as we say in San Antonio. But there's a lot in front of us yet to do. And I think the microgrid strategy actually provides us with a whole better landscape. I think Thomas Edison, if he were to come in here today with our technology today in 2018, he might build it with a microgrid strategy in place and throw away the old. That's the thing in the future, and that's really the upside in all this, the benefit.
Eric, you go first.
Okay. Yeah, I could just summarize some of the things we've talked about here today, that the dissemination of knowledge around how to think about practical architectures and structures and processes and checklists for thinking about secure systems, those exist now, and they're spreading at venues like this and other places. So the situation isn't at all hopeless. There are a variety of tools, dozens if not hundreds, that can be brought to bear on locking down our energy networks. The key is you have to have the expertise in-house that can oversee your system and implement these things in a smart and layered way. And when you have those things, then we have a real good chance of building secure systems that stand up to attacks. If they get knocked down, they're resilient, they come back quickly, they can shift power around, keep critical assets online, and we have the tools. It's not a question of how do we solve this problem. In large part, we know the approach to solving the problem. It's just doing it with vigilance and diligence and consistency.
And money.
Yeah. Okay, so now I'll tell you about how to do cybersecurity on the cheap. I built a test bed at NREL when I ran cybersecurity there. That's still there. You can go to Golden, Colorado, to the ESIF building, and there's a complete distribution SCADA system that I put up there. I got some lab-directed R&D money, and I used it very wisely. I have DC Systems RT SCADA over there that PG&E uses for their SCADA. There's a grid simulation software that I use Modbus server for that. And then I have actual DER connected with batteries, inverters, the works. So everything we're talking about here, soup to nuts, exists in that testbed. And the cybersecurity architecture that I implemented without using any of DNP3's security controls or Modbus security controls or any end device security, except for a strong username and password, which I think is your basic thing that you want. We've had 2 sets of red teaming tests done by defense and intelligence experts who have come. No one has broken that system, whether from outside getting in, whether sitting in the IT VLAN, or even in the OT VLAN. So the good news is, off-the-shelf products today, zero research is needed to secure these power systems. Now, what is the challenge? The challenge is humans. If you ever saw the movie Down and Out in Beverly Hills, when Nick Nolte lands in the swimming pool, he's a homeless guy and he lands in the pool facing down. Richard Dreyfuss is running up and down, wearing his little thing, shouting, "Call 911, call 911." I mean, he could have picked up the phone and called himself. But that's the closest thing to what I see people's reaction to this cybersecurity problem. Irrational fear without doing anything about it. While the solution is there, 911, just pick up the phone and call. So I'm using this analogy from culture just to give you an idea that hysteria will not solve the problem. Cool thinking is needed. Rational thinking is needed. And do you know what happens with an irrational mindset? You end up wasting money. Because there are vendors out there that are economically incented to take as much money as they can without solving your problem. Solving the problem is incidental. And I'm an integrator now, and I'm telling you this. We need to have a new relationship between asset owners and integrators if we're going to solve the cyber problem, so that the integrators are being out-tasked, not outsourced. As you said, the architecture has to belong to the asset owner. It cannot be outsourced. Then, once you own the architecture, then you decide who you want to bring in to fulfill the tenets of the architecture.
Well, thank you all very much. We have time for a couple audience questions. I see we got one back there.
I really have two questions. So my name is Alex, I'm with Leidos, but my background is at Lockwood. And Lockwood Martin, as you probably know, authored the cyber kill chain and intelligence-driven defense, which preaches people, process, and technology, and also states that the ultimate security maturity state is predictive. Would you say that the utility industry is heading towards an area where their security organizations are becoming predictive? Are there any utilities out there that are at that defense contractor security maturity level? And then my second question deals with nation states. So in the breaches that we've seen occur in the United States, it's always been, for the most part, in critical infrastructure, small assets like the dam in upstate New York. Why is it that these nation states are targeting these smaller facilities as compared to going for like the hot coal?
Right.
And do you agree that being predictive is the ultimate state for security maturity?
I believe the predictive state is where we're headed. Salt River Project is probably a utility that's probably further out there than most in using predictive data. I know they are on their customer side, and they have progressive technologies on the security side as well. But we've started to use predictive data more on the safety side, but we're not where we need to be. This is a matter of, I think the point was made about, it's a matter of managing people and dealing with the behaviors. And the behaviors that we see are similar to safety, to cyber threats, to physical threats. So yes, the data is commonly linked. Go ahead.
Okay. So I have been involved in cyber governance assessments of 20 utilities across the US in the last 2 years. And I was amazed to find that sometimes very small munis and co-ops were more advanced in their cyber maturity than many large investor-owned utilities. It was a very interesting observation. Really, it comes down to initiatives of individuals in utilities and how progressive they are in their thinking, how many innovative people they spend time with, and then are empowered to bring that change in the organization. That is far more than who's got the shiniest firewall or everybody is buying standard firewalls and intrusion detections. That's not the big deal. It's about initiative. So I think predictive is the way to go, but there is a big impediment to predictive. And now I'm going to be a little critical. A lot of the threat information sharing infrastructure is broken. When I say it's broken, I don't mean that you don't get alerts. You're getting plenty of alerts. If anyone sits down and looks at what EISAC is sending or the certs are sending, talk about job security. It's the ultimate. You could just sit and look at that reams and reams of data. But where's the actionable intelligence in that is specific to the electric sector? We're fundamentally missing. With all this machine-to-machine learning that we're talking about, sticks and taxi, which is the structured way of threat information sharing, ask how much electric sector specific structured data there is. Can you imagine it would be like the old SNMP days with network management and not having MIBs for CPU utilization of a Cisco router or, the buffer misses. Just MIB2? MIB2 would not cut it in network management. So what we need is a specialized project, and I'm expecting like a collaborative research project for utilities to fund this so that sticks and taxi can be expanded to include electric sector specific objects so that machine-to-machine learning can occur, so that defense and intelligence agencies, when they provide real-time threats, can be brought into the utility fabric without having to read PDF documents and Word documents and trying to find that little intelligence, because that's too tedious. And until we don't do that, we can't really fully realize the predictive model.
I'll just add a few comments. I agree on the predictive goal, or at least as a further tool in detecting and heading off cyber attacks. As Erfan mentioned at the top of this conversation, the complexity of data moving around networks, whether they're locally at a microgrid level or larger, is growing exponentially. And with all that noise, it's becoming harder and harder to find lurkers from outside. And so if you can build systems that can make sense of all that traffic and find and predict bands within which the data should be moving, and you notice anomalies, then you have another opportunity to zoom in and see if something's going on there. And at every level, from microgrid control level on up, these are tools that are coming down the pike to be used. To your second question about why certain smaller facilities, I think there's a couple answers to that. One is those are probably places that had particular weaknesses that let hackers get in and stay in. I'm sure they're trying to get at a variety of sites, small to large. It could also be that the attackers are observing and learning about particular types of industrial control systems that they know is deployed elsewhere, but at a particular site where they can get in and hang out and extract data and figure out how it works, they'll take that information and reload and use it elsewhere. And so there could be a variety of factors as to why it perhaps looks odd as to where we're seeing some of these attacks turn up. And of course, the last piece is maybe we just haven't found everything yet, right? There's always things going on that we haven't detected yet. So there's more to the story there.
Okay, and I am being told that we're short on time here. So I'm sure if you have more questions, we'll all be hanging around this evening at the bar. I'd like to thank Erik and Erfan and Fred for coming out here, and to all of you for coming out here to Austin and ETS. Thank you very much.
Thank you.